Hello and welcome to Chapter 9 in Healthcare Supervision. Chapter 9, we're covering leadership and the supervisor. Now, this is a little lengthier chapter. There are 31 slides in this PowerPoint. We may end up breaking this one down into a couple different lectures. We'll just see. But again, I'm going to hit the highlights as I have in the previous chapters. So the text, we're actually going to start on page 153, talking about the patterns of leadership. And we have 5 listed here in our PowerPoint. We have exploitative autocracy, benevolent autocracy, bureaucracy, consultative leadership, and participative leadership. So let's kind of discuss each one of these in a little more detail. So 2 of these, the leader holds absolute power. That's going to be exploitative autocracy and benevolent autocracy. Now, exploitative autocracy is going to be our harshest leadership style. They wield that absolute power over people in their group, but they also use that group to serve their personal interest. So they're literally exploiting their followers. Now, in benevolent autocracy, you kind of have that father's knows best attitude, where they're usually kind and generally sincere in believing that the behavior of those in the group has to be closely ordered and regulated for the good of the organization. And so further along we get in this chapter and we're talking about autocratic leadership, we're going to be talking about this leadership pattern. All right, so moving on to bureaucracy. What do you think of when you hear the word bureaucracy? You think of government red tape. So bureaucracy is a term that immediately raises visions of mass federal and state government agencies. As a leadership pattern, it refers to the primary emphasis on rules and regulations. The bureaucratic leader goes by the book, creating new rules and regulations as new situations arise, to such an extent that the book, in quotes, itself often becomes more important than the purpose it's intended to serve. Then we have our consultative and participative leadership. So consultative leadership is exhibited when the leader remains open to input from members of the group, but by practice, attitude, they still retain full decision-making authority. So in many cases where consultative leadership is appropriate, it's still often considered and practiced under a participative level. Some supervisors claim they're open to participation, but in practice they're only open as long as the employees come up with the same decisions they would have made themselves. Now, your participative leadership, this exists when plans or decisions are made by all of the department's employees as a group or team. The supervisor is a key member of the group, providing advice, information, and assistance in any way possible, but in advance has made the decision to accept the outcome of the group process. Okay, so that's our 5 patterns of leadership. Let's talk about theory X and theory Y. So still on that same page 154, Douglas McGregor in his landmark work, The Human Side of Enterprise, wrote 2 of the opposing approaches to management, theory X and theory Y. So theory X, in its pure state, is autocratic leadership. Theory Y is participative leadership. So we're going to talk about some of the differences. But our first assumption is going to be common between theory X and theory Y. And that assumption is that management remains responsible for organizing the elements of all productive activity, bringing together the money, people, equipment, and supplies needed to accomplish the organization's goals. So that's going to be common between X and Y. But here's our other assumptions about theory X. People must be actively managed. They need to be directed, they need to be motivated, their actions must be controlled, their behavior modified to fit the needs of the organization. And without this active intervention by management, people would be passive and even resistant to organizational needs. Therefore, people must be persuaded, controlled, rewarded, or punished as necessary to accomplish the aims of the organization. Our second assumption, or third assumption about theory X, the average person is by nature indolent, working as little as possible. The average person lacks ambition, shuns responsibility, and in general prefers to be led. So basically, we're saying that the average person is inherently self-centered, they're resistant to change, and indifferent to the needs of the organization. But theory Y, on the other hand, is predicated on the following assumptions. People are not naturally passive or resistant to organizational needs. If they appear to have become so, this condition is a result of experience in organizations. Motivation, development potential, willingness to assume responsibility, and readiness to work toward organizational goals are present in most people. It is management's responsibility to make it possible for people to recognize and develop these characteristics for themselves. And the last one, the essential task of management is to arrange organizational conditions and methods of operation so people can best achieve their own goals by directing their efforts towards the goals of the organization. So we're talking two completely different specters here. So if you're an autocratic leader, you're operating under theory X assumptions. If you are a participative leader, you're generally ascribing to the theory Y assumptions and encourage your employees to participate in joint decisions. All right, so let's talk a little bit about perception. And we're moving over to 155 on the right side of the page, second full paragraph on that page. There is no single style of leadership that is appropriate to all people and situations at all times. Now, however, there is more reason than ever before to believe that consultative and participative leadership is most appropriate to modern organizations and today's educated workers. And so a final word about style. Some supervisors and managers put much effort into telling employees what style of management they practice. And so we have a couple of examples here of the manager saying, well, I practice employee empowerment. My door is always open. I want your input. I believe in total equality management. But there are hazards in presenting oneself in this manner. First, in the words of a wise anonymous observer, it's Management 101, using the buzzwords, saying what you think you should be saying. Second, and far greater a hazard, is the risk of being trapped by employee perception. It only takes one or two perceived contradictions of your self-described style to create dissonance. And as soon as you're seen unilaterally making a decision, or as soon as someone finds you unavailable, although you've said your door is always open, you've created a conflict between your words and your actions. It is probably best to say as little as necessary about your own management style and let your actions convey your style. In other words, instead of telling them what you are, let your actions show them. All right, so let's talk about acceptance. We're going to move over under leadership's primary characteristic. Last paragraph on the page of 156. The single factor that defines or characterizes a true leader is the acceptance by the followers. This means acceptance of the individual as a leader, not simply obedience to the position the individual occupies. Obedience, although it may be grudging, will often be extended to the position because of the authority of the position itself. However, willing obedience will be extended consistently only by those employees who have accepted the supervisor's leadership. Acceptance by one's followers cannot be mandated. It must be earned. Without this acceptance, a supervisor is a manager in title only and a leader not at all. So I'm sure at some point in your time, whether working part-time jobs or whether working full-time jobs, you've had a manager and you may have just not liked them at all. And so where you would obey because they were your manager, you didn't necessarily do it willingly. So that's what this is talking about. Okay, so wordplay, leadership versus management. With this highly positive connotation placed on the word leadership, if you read that first paragraph, you're going to get a little more information. We're left with an eroded connotation of management, conveying the impression that somehow mere management does not measure up to leadership. However, management and leadership remain two words that are generally synonymous and freely interchangeable in many uses. As suggested previously, someone can be a manager or supervisor, director, coordinator, administrator, CEO, or whatever in title without being a true leader. However, this in no way renders management as a whole anything less than, nor anything significantly from, leadership. There's poor management and there's good management. There's poor leadership and there's good leadership. One can be a manager in title without being a leader, but in terms of function, one cannot manage without leading and cannot lead without managing. Good leadership and good management go together, as do poor leadership and poor management. We frequently hear management described as both art and science. We might say the same about leadership, but we're usually ready to consider leadership more as art. Leadership is more likely to inspire thoughts of the human element, whereas management conjures up images of techniques and tools. All right, so dropping down to can you lead by the book? If we accept the contention that good leadership or good management is both art and science, we can perhaps reason that leading or managing by the book is only partially possible. However, one of the errors commonly committed by struggling leaders is over-reliance on what we might refer to as cookie-cutter management. Cookie-cutter management is what occurs when we attempt to apply specifically named management techniques or kinds of management, often cynically described as flavors of the month. Think of what occurs when you roll out a batch of cookie dough and apply a cookie cutter. You obtain a desired shape, but you also get leftover material. Even if you roll out the leftover dough and cut another time or two, you're still left with the remaining lump of dough that fails to fit the required shape. Whenever effort is applied to produce a desired shape from some form of input, some of the material, but not all of it, is squeezed into the desired shape. Like the dough left outside of the cookie cutter, the extra material that falls away during the shaping process is ignored, for all the practical purposes lost to consideration. This is what occurs when we attempt to apply formula management. All right, so let's look at an employee's view on 158. Not all employees in a department will view the supervisor in the same light or develop the same impression of the supervisor as a leader. Each of your employees will experience your leadership style in bits and pieces and add up to a total impression. As long as you're convinced that you're doing the best job you know how to do, there is little to be gained from worrying about the opinion your employees hold of you. However, it pays to remember that your view of yourself as a leader is rarely the same as the view of you that your employees hold. What you see as your strengths may not be seen as strong points by your employees. Conversely, what your employees see as your strong points may not even have occurred to you as significant characteristics of your style. Now, I'm not trying to get philosophical with this, but let's just apply this to normal life. I mean, who cares whether you're a manager, if you're a worker, if you're a principal, if you're a student, if you're a teacher, if you're a fireman, if whatever. Does this not still hold true for everyone? I mean, what you see as your strengths, someone else may not necessarily see that, and then they see your strengths, and you're like, well, where did that come from? So a lot of the stuff in this book doesn't necessarily just have to hold to management or leadership. You know, there's a lot of good life lessons in this book if you read it. You know, substitute the word employees as family members, or substitute it as friends, or, you know, whatever applies to you. So again, not trying to get philosophical, but, you know, sometimes take this information and kind of turn it around so that it's, you know, applicable to other aspects of your life. All right, so let's talk about visible supervisors. Over on 159. To provide true leadership to the work group, the supervisor must be seen as an integral part of the work unit and must in fact be such a part of the work unit. To get things done effectively through employees, as a supervisor, you should, number one, be visible and available, spending most of your time where you're really needed. Number two, show concern for employees' problems. Number three, maintain a true open door attitude so that your employees can always reach you when they need you. And number 4, rely on immediate feedback to let all of your employees know exactly where they stand. Much of true leadership is provided by visible example, and the more visible you are to your employees, the greater the chance of you gaining their acceptance. All right, so what does it mean to lead by default? The supervisor who is frequently neither visible nor available is often put in a position of leading by default. When the supervisor cannot be found or does not act, different employees will proceed or not proceed, as the case may be, in different ways. In the absence of direction, some employees will bite the bullet and use their own best judgment in taking action. Some, however, will do nothing and allow events to follow their normal course, which may lead just as easily to disaster as to inconsequential results. The majority of defaults occur because allowing them is the supervisor's path of least resistance. Because one soon discovers that default is frequently neutral and occasionally even helpful, there often develops a temptation to just let things go until they resolve themselves. Given the crush of activities many supervisors are regularly drawn into, it can be extremely tempting to sometimes let events follow their natural course. However, default management will not long be seen as representative of real leadership. Your employees should, of course, be encouraged to work independently as much as reasonable under the circumstances. But it is important for them to know that you're readily available when needed and that you will not default on them. All right, so let's talk about communication. Moving over to page 161. Now, this is a little bit over halfway, so we're going to finish this communicating with employees, leadership, and action section, and we're going to end this lecture, and then we'll start another one finishing out the chapter. All right, so communicating with employees. On any given day, the largest part of a supervisor's job is likely to consist of interpersonal contact with his or her direct reporting employees. In recognition of the supervisor's constant contact with the employees to get things accomplished through them, the remainder of this chapter concentrates on face-to-face communication specifically within the context of the supervisor-employee relationship. For the sake of simplicity, we might describe communication as the transfer of meaning. So in an organizational sense, communication involves the transmission of information and instructions from person to person in such a way as to accomplish mutual understanding on the part of both the sender and the receiver of every message. The goal of communication is always a complete and accurate transfer of meaning, resulting in assurance that the understanding of the person who received the message is identical to that of the person who originated the message. Regarding the supervisor-employee relationship, recognize that there is no single, absolutely correct way of dealing with employees. Your employees are different from each other, and they are all different from you. What works well in your relationship with one may not work at all in your relationship with another. Think about this in terms of, for you that are parents that have more than one child, not one of your children is the same as the other. And what discipline works on one, the other could care less about. I could ground my oldest from his iPad and he'll put it up for weeks and not think about it anymore. You tell my youngest, no more iPad, and he is climbing the walls because he spends a lot of time on the iPad and that's just torture to him. So not every person's the same, so not every action is going to be the same with those people. So dropping down to that last section, an effective relationship with each employee is not something that can simply be established and assumed to exist forever. No such relationship between two people is ever completely established. It must be constantly nurtured and conscientiously maintained if it is to serve appropriately the needs of the people involved and the organization. Although interpersonal relations can constitute a large part of the supervisor's job, it's not always easy to concentrate on people and their problems and needs. There are hidden pressures that encourage a focus on things rather than people. After all, things cannot hurt, disappoint, frustrate, influence, disagree, or misunderstand. There is a measure of safety and security in things. However, the supervisor must learn to overcome the tendency to seek reduced vulnerability and look in the direction of the job's true demands. All right, so we're going to pick up with individualism in the next lecture.